Here's what's coming up on The World Today. Police and protesters clash in Hong Kong over the new Chinese law coming into effect. Meanwhile, Seattle police are trying to clear out a protest zone in the city that they claim has become lawless and brutal. Plus, at least 19 people die in an explosion in Tehran, Iran. A warm welcome to the program and thanks for joining us. I'm Amarachi Ubani. The protests in Hong Kong over the new law imposed by China have turned violent, with pockets of clashes between the police and the protesters. Now, at least 370 people have been detained during today's protests, 10 of them for breaching the new national security law. 7 police officers were also injured, including one who was allegedly stabbed by a rioter. We'll have more on that story in a bit, but the VOA's Nike Ching is in Washington for us. Nike, great to see you. How will this new law affect Hong Kong's sovereignty?
In brief, the so-called one country, two systems and a high degree of autonomy that China has promised to give Hong Kong 23 years ago today has been undermined to one country, one system. The United States believe that there's now no difference between people living in Hong Kong and living in mainland China because they are subject to the same judicial systems. For example, one of the most immediate worries is that a person may be subject to indefinite detention if he or she speaks up peacefully or even participate a rally peacefully.
Indeed, and there has been a lot of reactions from leaders around the world. The U.S., one of them, responding to this. Secretary Mike Pompeo did say he threatened Beijing with new countermeasures, one of which is removing the region's special status. China has condemned the comment. So where did this leave the U.S. and China in their relations?
The relationship between the United States and China has been worsening. Many experts believe that the tensions between the U.S. and China is further escalating after what China is doing on Hong Kong to pass the national security law, and it's unlikely to reverse. So the worst. Many believe that it's the worst relationship in decades. Now, the United States announced more actions, as you mentioned earlier, including visa restrictions on current and former Chinese Communist Party officials deemed as responsible for undermining Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy or undermining human rights and fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong. And earlier this week, we also see that the United States is ending defense and dual-use technology exports to Hong Kong. Last week, the United States Senate passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It's a legislation that will impose sanctions on foreign individuals and entities that materially contribute to China's failure to preserve Hong Kong's autonomy. And this morning, we heard from the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said that the State Department will comply with the Hong Kong Autonomy Act.
Nike, thanks again for speaking with us. We couldn't hear the last words, but we got the better part of what you were trying to say. Thanks again for joining us on the program. So the protests in Hong Kong are now over the new law imposed by China. Nike was trying to explain there how the U.S. is reacting to this. But 370 people at the last count have been arrested in today's protests. 10 of those people were arrested for opposing and breaching this new national security law.
Mr. Speaker, what message...
On the 23rd anniversary of former British colonial control handing over to Chinese rule in Hong Kong, a ceremonial flag raising held in the region. just after the passing of a new national security law took place.
And the enactment and imposition of this national security law constitutes a clear and serious breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It violates Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and is in direct conflict with Hong Kong basic law. The law also threatens the freedoms and rights protected by the Joint Declaration. We made clear, Mr. Speaker, that if China continued down this path, we would introduce a new route for those with British national overseas status to enter the UK, granting them limited leave to remain with the ability to live and work in the UK and thereafter to apply for citizenship. And that is precisely what we will do now.
The disputed law will punish secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign entities with up to life imprisonment, ushering in a more authoritarian era in what has been called China's freest city. In response to criticism from the United States, Britain, and others about the new national security law for the city, China is urging foreign countries to stop interfering in Hong Kong.
香港事务是中国内政，外界不应干涉。
Hong Kong matters are China's internal affair. Foreign forces should not interfere. The legislation of the national security law belongs to our national jurisdiction. China's National People's Congress established and completed the system, a mechanism for the implementation of the national security law based on regulation from China's constitution and the Hong Kong Basic Law, and has filled in the loopholes for Hong Kong's national security law.
Although many protesters are resigning from their groups, some are refusing to succumb to the new law quietly. Within 24 hours of its passing, Hong Kong police arrested a man holding a flag advocating for independence, making it the first arrest under a sweeping national security law Beijing introduced overnight. Further violence has erupted in the Chinese Special Administrative Region as police use water cannons and tear gas to break up protesters. During an arrest at the protest earlier today, an officer was stabbed in the arm by rioters holding sharp objects. Hong Kong police later said they made more than 70 arrests for illegal assembly and other offenses, with some involving violations under the new law.
So Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, says she's been doing her best to convince people about the benefits of this new law. It's obviously not working, judging from the protests. And once again, she says the promulgation and implementation of the law on safeguarding national security in Hong Kong shows the commitment of the central government to uphold and improve the one country, two systems principle. That comment she made earlier today in her weekly press briefing. She also refuted criticism about the law undermining the one country, two systems, saying the central government wishes to improve the principle through the National Security Protection Law so that the stability and prosperity enjoyed by Hong Kong people in the past 23 years would continue. Let's talk to Director General Bolitac's Center for Diplomacy and Strategic Studies, Professor Bola Akiterwa, about what's going on in Hong Kong. Professor, thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
A lot of people have been reading meanings into this new security law, and they say this is China's plan to annex Hong Kong and to make it a part of China once again. And it is also a breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. What do you think?
I don't think that the whole world is actually missing the point. We are not addressing the critical issue there. When we talk about the basic law or the Sino-British declaration, that particular declaration is at the level of two sovereign states, and that is China and that is the United Kingdom. But the problem on ground in Hong Kong is not between China and Britain. It is simply between China and the Hong Kongers. In this case, the nature of the problem is completely different. When you are looking at the situation at the level of China and the United Kingdom, you will be talking about one country, two systems. Now, meaning that there is only one China, implying that there will never be a case for Hong Kong to become a sovereign and independent state. But now on the ground, the problem is at the level of Beijing and Hong Kong. And that is the issue of self-determination. The Hong Kongers will want to be completely separate. They're not talking about one country, two systems. This is the major problem, and this is why there is problem. And in this particular case, my thinking is that we need to address the question of self-determination, not simply in the context of international law and relations, which initially referred to dependent territories, dependent countries, colonialism. Now we are not talking about self-determination in terms of secession. So it's completely different, and the world will need to sit down and address that question.
Professor, are you saying that Hong Kong does not have a right to self-determination just because of the one-party, two systems principle of China? And you think that the rest of the world should back off from this conversation?
Certainly, I've not been saying that, and I will not say that. Every people has a right to self-determination. Is there. It's well provided for in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, December 10, 1948. Is there. But the issue now is that self-determination is now being redefined in international law, no longer in the context of colonialism, but in the context of situations where a people, all right, will no longer be well protected. They are now looking, for instance, in the context of genocidal crimes, crimes against humanity. In fact, that's why, for instance, a new principle has been adopted, that is the international responsibility to protect. So self-determination is still there. In Nigeria, for instance, the Yoruba people believe that they are being marginalized, they are being oppressed, and they have just gone to join the World Unprotected People's Organization. So the Hong Kongers can have that right. That's why I said the nature of the problem is no longer the issue of one country, two systems.
So should the rest of the world help Hong Kong become free of China, because that's what the people want?
In this case, there's nothing wrong in helping Hong Kong, but the implications are many. If you are not going to help Hong Kong, you will be going against the standardized rule of the United Nations General Assembly. The UN General Assembly does not allow these secessionist tendencies in its member states. First point. The second point is that when we talk about territorial integrity of a country, no country in the world will want to allow its dismemberment. So any country that is seeking to aid and abet must be prepared also for the consequences at the level of its own country. How will you expect Nigeria, for instance now, in spite of our cordial relationship with China, to now come into the open and say you are supporting Hong Kong? Nigeria's policy is one China, two systems, not dismemberment.
Professor Bola Akintarewa, thank you. Thank you again. You've given us some things to think about, but thanks again for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Let's turn to the protests in the United States as Seattle police work to clear out a protest zone in the city they claim has become lawless and brutal following weeks of violence, 4 nights including 4 shootings and the deaths of 2 teenagers. A move comes after Mayor Jenny Durkan declared the gathering of the people in and around the police department's East Precinct and Cal Anderson Park an unlawful assembly. 4 nights of gun violence in the last 10 days have left 2 black teenagers dead and 2 more people hospitalized amid an increasingly diminished presence of demonstrators in the Capitol Hill occupied protests outside the abandoned East Precinct. President Donald Trump has been demanding that Washington State and Seattle take action to eject the protesters, calling them domestic terrorists. But city authorities had until today taken a non-confrontational approach to the matter.
Southbound on 12th Avenue.
We'll be talking more about these protests after the break with our correspondent, but also still ahead, marking the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, acclaimed composer Max Richter releases a new album. You want to see this? Stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. We spoke about the protests in Minneapolis and police fighting off protesters at the autonomous zone in New York City. The council has voted to pass the 2021 budget with cuts to police funding after weeks of fraught negotiations with Mayor Bill de Blasio. But some lawmakers are complaining that if the bill falls short of a $1 billion cut that and protesters had demanded. A majority of 32 lawmakers voted via teleconference to pass the budget minutes shy of the midnight deadline. And then 17 voted against outside an empty city hall. More than 1,000 protesters, you see there, were demanding the shrinking of a police department that they decry as violent and racist, which they have been going on for a few weeks now. Let's speak to our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, about the recent happenings. Maria, let's begin with the situation that's progressing in Seattle. What initially was a peaceful zone has turned violent, even resulted in the deaths of 2 teenagers in a shooting. Do these protesters still have the right to occupy the zone now that the violence has erupted?
So the mayor put out an executive order on Tuesday, which asked for that areas to be dispersed and for the police to go in and to remove individuals from that area due to just what you mentioned, the violence that has occurred in that area. She's stated that, again, Seattle and the city of Seattle is in full support of Black Lives Matter. They're full support of peaceful protesting. But when you have violence breaking out in a peaceful protest zone, that then requires the government to do something and to take action. And so there was information and tweets that went out yesterday saying that if the area was not dispersed by today, individuals still in the area refusing to leave will be arrested. And so the police did go in to disperse that area.
And in New York, the protesters still occupying the New York Autonomous Zone, and there has been police presence in that area. Now the budget cuts have been made. What will happen to those protesters that are occupying this autonomous zone?
Well, the protesters will be there unless, again, there's an executive order that is done. I think the mayor expected some of this to occur. Obviously, people are questioning, where's the money going to go? Are they just going to move it toward putting police officers in schools? Because they've obviously said it's moving toward education in the city of New York. And so New Yorkers, the ones that I've spoken to regarding this, are saying that they believe the protests should be allowed to continue. But obviously, again, if you see violence breaking out, you will see similar situations as Seattle, and they will probably put an executive order in place to disperse of those individuals. But you have to also remember, and this was been questioned of the mayor just the past couple of hours, is that we've seen an increase in violence in the city of New York. But again, as he says, New York is still one of the safest, largest cities in the world. And so despite the increase in violence that we've seen over the past few months, they still believe that they are far below which many major cities their size would have as far as violence goes. And so the hope is that the protesters are able to peacefully protest, but if things continue to be violent, you will probably see similar situations as Seattle.
Maria, thanks again for bringing us up to speed, and do stay safe in Washington.
Thank you.
Stay bit in the United States as President Donald Trump has approved a plan to withdraw 9,500 American troops from bases in Germany. The Pentagon says the move will reduce the number of U.S. troops in the country from about 34,500 to about 25,000. President Trump has previously accused Germany of not contributing to NATO, but last week the president said some of the soldiers will be moved to Poland instead. And in Iran, at least 19 people were killed, 6 of them injured on Tuesday in an explosion at a medical clinic in the north of the capital, Tehran. According to the deputy governor, Hamid Gurdazi, a gas leak caused the blast. Two gas cylinder canisters, outside a home that was located approximately 80 meters away from the clinic just blew off. Footage of the clinic showed parts of the building burned down, debris across the floor, and broken windows. The clinic, which had about 25 employees inside at the time of the blast, primarily carries out light surgeries and medical imaging.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Now, acclaimed composer Max Richter's new album, Voices, features multiple narrators reading part of the text of the 70-year-old Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which he believes can stir hope in the world where we lurch from crisis to crisis. His speech starts with the voice of Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945, and who was instrumental in setting up the Declaration in 1948 after World War II. Roosevelt explains the Declaration is for all peoples and all nations. Actor Kiki Lane then reads Article 1, which begins, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights," to a musical accompaniment. Other voices, crowdsourced by Richter, take over the reading of the text, and they read part of the text in their native language, which asserts that every person has the right to life, liberty, and security without distinction, such as by race, color, social origin, religion, or politics.
The end that every individual and every organ of society.
And that's The World Today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.